You're camped on a strip of marshland at the edge of the world, 8,200 years ago. The air smells like salt and peat smoke. Somewhere past the reeds, the sea is doing something it has never done in your lifetime, pulling back, exposing seabed that shouldn't exist. Then it comes back. Not a wave. A wall. Far to the north, in narrow Norwegian fjords, water is climbing more than 20 meters up the cliffs, swallowing everything in its path. Here, on the low ground of a place called Doggerland, there's nowhere to climb. You check a weather app before you leave the house. You get a push notification 3 days before a hurricane makes landfall. An evacuation order 48 hours out. A flood zone baked into your home insurance. None of that existed for the people standing on Doggerland that day. No forecast, no sirens, no word for evacuation route, because no one had ever needed one before. So how did people with no warning systems, no maps, and no written language survive floods big enough to erase entire land masses? And, in some cases, pass the memory of those floods down for thousands of years afterward? Start with the place itself. Doggerland once connected what's now Britain to mainland Europe, dry ground where the North Sea sits today. In 2020, archaeologist Vince Gaffney and his team at the University of Bradford finished a decade-long project reconstructing it, using seismic survey data borrowed from oil companies who'd originally mapped the seafloor for entirely different reasons. What they found was a landscape of rivers, lakes, and hunting grounds, slowly drowning as post-glacial sea levels climbed. By 8,200 years ago, most of it was already gone, shrunk to a scatter of low islands. Then came Storegga, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway that displaced enough seabed to send a tsunami across the entire North Sea basin. Norwegian geologist Stein Bondevik spent years digging through sediment in coastal lakes and found the tsunami's fingerprint directly, a layer of sand and marine shells dropped in a single afternoon, in places where waves reached more than 20 meters up narrow fjords. For whoever was left on Doggerland's last islands, that wasn't a storm. That was the ending. So what actually got people through it? Cross to the other side of Europe, and the flood story gets stranger. In 1997, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, working out of Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, ran sonar surveys across the floor of the Black Sea. They found an old, drowned shoreline, beach sand, freshwater mollusk shells, sitting about 155 meters below the current surface. Their theory, around 7,600 years ago, rising Mediterranean water finally breached a natural barrier at what's now the Bosphorus Strait, and the sea poured into a lower freshwater basin below. Ryan and Pittman's original estimate had water rushing in fast enough to submerge roughly 60,000 square miles of farmland within months, not centuries. Worth saying plainly, that catastrophic timeline is still debated. Some later studies argue the flooding was slower and less dramatic than the 1997 paper claimed. But even the conservative estimates describe a coastline retreating fast enough that entire farming communities had to abandon land within a single generation. Everyone assumes flood myths are just stories, stretched and exaggerated over centuries of retelling. The truth is that at least one of them might be a memory. Some researchers connect the Black Sea event directly to the flood narratives that surface later in Mesopotamian and biblical texts. The same geography, the same sudden, permanent loss of land. Now, go to the other end of the world, and the memory gets even longer. In 2016, geographer Patrick Nunn, working with linguist Nicholas Reed, published a study in the journal Australian Geographer, analyzing 21 separate oral traditions from Aboriginal communities across the Australian coastline. Every one of them described the same thing. Land that used to be dry, now underwater. Islands that used to be hills. Coastlines that used to sit much further out. When Nunn and Reed cross-checked those stories against the geological record of sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, the details matched, in some cases describing flooding that happened more than 7,000 years ago, and in a handful of cases, more than 10,000. That's not folklore drifting loosely through time. That's a coastline redrawn, and the memory of it carried forward, accurately, for roughly 400 generations. So how do you carry a warning that far without ever writing it down? China has an answer, and it comes with a date attached. Chinese legend describes a catastrophic flood tamed by a ruler named Yu the Great, credited with founding the Xia dynasty, for a long time treated by historians as pure myth, with no real event behind it. Then in 2016, a research team led by Qinglong Wu at Peking University published findings in the journal Science identifying a real flood, dated to around 1920 BC, caused by a massive landslide that dammed the Yellow River near Jishi Gorge. When that natural dam broke, it released an estimated 11 to 16 cubic kilometers of water downstream in a single surge, one of the largest floods of the last 10,000 years anywhere on Earth. The timing lines up almost exactly with the traditional start of the Xia dynasty. Everyone assumes the people who survived these floods just got lucky. The Yellow River evidence suggests something closer to the opposite. The community that endured this flood didn't just survive it. They organized around it, and that organization is part of what later Chinese historians describe as the founding act of an entire dynasty. Line these up, and a pattern shows up that has nothing to do with luck. Doggerland's last inhabitants had no way to outrun a tsunami with 20-meter waves. The ones who made it, statistically, were already living somewhere else by the time it hit, in bands that had been slowly retreating inland for generations before the final wave arrived. The Black Sea communities who survived did the same thing. They left before the water finished rising, not after. The real survival tool across every one of these events wasn't strength, and it wasn't luck. It was distance. Physical distance, built by retreating early, and generational distance, built by telling children exactly which hills used to be underwater. Go back to that strip of marshland on Doggerland, 8,200 years ago. The people who lived aren't the ones who fought the wave. They're the ones who'd already left, who trusted a feeling passed down from someone older that the water was coming, long before it arrived. You have satellites now. Flood maps. Push notifications 48 hours out. What you don't always have is the thing that actually kept people alive back then. A willingness to believe an old story about water before the water shows up to prove it right. Ancient humans didn't survive the floods by beating them. They survived by believing the people who saw it coming first.